Hi everyone, today's topic of discussion is a controversial one, the issue of the power delta and surge changes for raid and dungeon content. Now that there's been a couple of weeks for things to cool off after contest mode Salvation's Edge, players have had plenty of time to let these changes marinate, and marinate they have. However, in the heated discourse over these changes, a lot of misinformation has been spread, resulting in some misconceptions that have been formed over this topic. I've been meaning to make a Sandbox analysis video series on YouTube for quite some time now, as I feel Destiny 2 in particular is lacking in this style of macro analysis content. Now, unfortunately, I wrote most of the script before Bungie released their TWID stating their intentions to partially revert the changes they decided to make to raid and dungeon content by effectively making all surges active at the same time, including kinetic options. While this is a step in the right direction, I still thought it might be insightful to discuss why the original -5+ surge change was a negative in the first place, as I saw a lot of community discussion stemming from this topic that I believe to be misguided. Before we start analyzing, let's clear up a few things. First, what actually changed with the Sandbox? For this, we turn to our good friend Mossy Max, who I've referenced in the past on the channel. According to him, there are 3 major changes that have occurred relating to boss health, power scaling, and surges in the final shape. First, boss health. According to my testing, boss health has changed drastically across the board in most raids and dungeons. For example, Templar's health has gone from around 6.3 million to around 9.7 million, marking an approximately 54% increase. Another example, Riven has gone from 2.6 million to 8.4 million, a 223% increase. Now, does this mean that Riven is over 3 times harder to kill in the final shape? Well, not really. Here's how Mossy explains this. On top of the changes we're about to discuss, Bungie unified the recommended power level of every raid and dungeon boss to 1950, with our gear power capping out at 1945, which is where this -5 number comes from. And for whatever reason, the numerical health of every enemy in this game scales with the recommended power level of the activity. So bosses that were from older raids with RPLs in the hundreds got a huge boost to their displayed numerical health, whereas some of the newer bosses like Iryut and Rathel didn't shift as much, being much closer to 1950 to begin with. So what does this mean for us as players? Well, for people doing damage testing and comparisons, this makes our lives a lot easier. If your Xenophage does 25,000 damage to Templar, it should do 25,000 damage to every other raid boss in the game, bar special modifiers. If you remember what my bosses tab looked like in the damage spreadsheet before the final shape, that's what the scalar column was for. So while a lot of bosses in the game appear to have more numerical health, remember that our weapons also used to do proportionally less to these bosses. The best way to understand this is by explaining the second change, power scaling. Before, you used to be able to overlevel yourself in any raid or dungeon up to 20 above the recommended power. However, if an encounter's recommended power was 500, even if you're 2000 power, you'd be capped at 520, meaning your weapons would also show up as doing less numerical damage compared to if you were in an encounter with a 2000 RPL. The important thing to note here is that encounter recommended power and gear power scale the same. So even if you and a boss are both 100, 500, or 10,000 power, it will still take the same amount of shots to kill said boss at all 3 of those values. So has the shots to kill metric changed for bosses then? This is where Mossy's famous graph comes in handy, since it uses scalars rather than explicit damage values. According to him, the change in outgoing damage from +20 to -5 in raids goes from 1.06x the baseline of campaign and new patrol content to 0.74x, representing a 35% nerf. To put this into more direct terms, if you took Xenophage with Well, Solar Surges, and Tractor and tried to kill Templar in Lightfall, it would take you about 121 shots. Today, it takes you 179, and that's with the global machine gun buff helping Xenophage out by 7%. This means you can expect your weapons to take 50% more time or ammo or total damage to kill any raid boss. To further corroborate Mossy's calculations, I actually went in and compared an entire suite of common weapons and their values before and after the final shape patch. And what do you know? The drop for baseline damage is right around 33%, using fusion rifles as an example, which lost spec mods but gained a 7% global buff to compensate. Finally, we have surges. I think everyone knows how these work now, but essentially every week, 2 random surges, 1 light and 1 dark, will boost your ability and weapon damage matching that affinity by 25% in raids and dungeons. Probably inspired by the Pantheon modifiers, this change undoubtedly served to offset the effect of losing a third of our previous damage, but even with surges active, we still need 15% more damage to reach what our previous outgoing damage numbers were. Now that we are all on the same page regarding the actual changes themselves, we need 50% more ammo to kill bosses, they're rotating 25% surges every week, let's look at the context of the discussion going on in the community. From what I've seen, there are a lot of experienced players from the endgame community critiquing this change, myself included. That in and of itself isn't particularly remarkable outside of the fact that a lot of people that are not typically outspoken have also chipped in on the matter. What is special though is that this is one of the only times that I can remember endgame players negatively reacting to an increase in difficulty, which I think has confused some people. The same people who are perceived as being responsible for the well nerf, the div nerf, and more, these people are now complaining that raids are harder and have harsher loadout penalties. Well, what gives? As such, I've seen quite a few participants in the discussion endorse beliefs that I don't think they even fully believe in order to get back at those they deem elitist or so-called meta slaves without understanding why exactly this change is bad for the game. In reality, many of the players complaining are players who not only enjoy challenges, but thrive off of them, so it doesn't make sense that a change primarily impacting one of the easiest endgame content pools would be an area of contention. So if the elitist endgame players aren't hypocrites, then why are they complaining about an increase in difficulty? The real issue these changes pose to the sandbox is twofold. First, given that we are now -5 instead of +20, this inherently makes normal raid and dungeon bosses about 50% more difficult to kill. Now you might be thinking, that's not so bad, it just makes things more challenging. Well, first of all, most people have criticized Bungie in the past for making bosses, especially solo dungeon bosses, that are just sandbags of health that substitute perceived real difficulty with artificial difficulty. Anyone else remember this term being thrown around back then? However, the real problem with this change is that we already have a difficulty tier for those that want an extra challenge, and it's called Master. The purpose of normal RAD difficulty is to experience the content first and foremost, without the unnecessary stressor of over-challenging combat. This allows players to try things out in 3-man or 6-man boss environments, instead of boxing them in and forcing them to struggle for a completion. Without a true normal difficulty experience, we are raising the barrier of entry to some of Destiny's best content, when the statistics show that the vast majority of Destiny players have not completed a dungeon, let alone a raid. I've met plenty of players who would maybe like to try a raid or dungeon, but have difficulty getting a group together. Why are we erecting additional barriers to the normal version of what Bungie has admitted is their most expensive yet most prestigious content to make? The second half of this comes from surges. Obviously, it would be nonsensical to tank damage by 35% and then not compensate players in any way, so Bungie's solution was to provide a rotating 40%, so 2 out of 5, coverage set of surges that change every week. As we've mentioned before, this doesn't fully recover the damage lost by the +20 to -5 conversion. However, I've seen some people say that this is still a good change, since it forces players to get creative and, in their words, stop being meta slaves by using the same weapons they've been using for the past however many years. The problem with this idea is that it fundamentally misunderstands how the damage meta works in this game. First of all, even if you wanted to implement some sort of rotating modifier to force players to use different weapons, it would have been better to rotate weapon types themselves rather than affinities. For example, a sword boss like Crota is still going to be a sword boss whether it's Solar Strand or Arc Stasis Surge like it is this week. The only thing that changes is the number of swords I need to keep in my vault. Instead of just a big quest, now I have to scour for an Abide the Return or an Ill Omen. Unless your opinion of changing the meta is changing what flavor of sword you have on, that isn't a meta change. It's like changing the shader on your sword and calling it a meta shift. And even if you did think that, you'd still be wrong, since players have always referred to metas by weapon type or strategy in this game. Whether we're talking about the double slug meta, the linear meta, or the rocket meta, metas have always been defined by the mechanical actions players perform during damage. If I'm still spamming sword attacks on a boss every week, that isn't a meta shift by any means. The only way a 25% surge would make a difference is if certain exotic weapons were so incredibly strong and unique that you'd shift between them depending on the week's surges, but unfortunately the game doesn't work that way. There are typically a very small handful of very good exotics at a time. For example, even if it's not Solar Week, players will still use Still Hunt with Celestial Nighthawk if they want to play optimally. On the flip side, what this change does do is force players, especially newer ones, who are trying their hand at raid and dungeon content to use a certain element of weapon or a certain subclass or play at a disadvantage, especially in a sandbox where -5 bosses are harder to kill than before, so their damage actually matters more than ever before. We have to acknowledge that normal RAD content is the casual space, where people can try out loadouts and experience raid and dungeons in a relaxed environment. If you want sweatier, arcade-style, rotating surge gameplay, go play Master content, where the purpose is to be challenged and restricted. Ironically, if this is an attempt by Bungie to drive experimentation and innovation in damage metas, it is having and will have the opposite effect, on top of causing the negative sentiment it already has within the community. After all, what is the purpose of spreading this Master experience to normal content? Who does this benefit? In conclusion, this is a controversial issue, but I hope I presented how I think a lot of the discussion surrounding it has been misguided by lack of clear information on the subject, whether it's incorrect power scaling numbers being thrown around, or a general lack of understanding how damage metas form over time. The main problem is that we have lost a lot of damage in an activity tier that should feel fun and safe for newer players instead of restrictive and challenging, with the only way to recover some of that damage is by using specific weapon affinities or subclasses that players may not have access to or want to use. All of these downsides, and yet we've already observed and discussed how this does not effectively drive loadout innovation or meta shifts. You might be asking yourself, if that won't drive a meta shift, then what will? As someone that has been observing, interpreting, and even defining the damage meta for the past year, let me tell you what actually drives meta changes in a positive way. Unique boss models are one method. As much as we like to complain about tormentors, they're crit priority models built upon the Techian model to produce an enemy that forces players to use precision weapons which, up until Still Hunt, were not generally the pack leaders when it came to DPS. In the same vein, encounter mechanics can incentivize players to use certain loadouts to handle certain objectives more effectively while still doing damage. Ability and weapon tuning are another way to change the meta in a more direct fashion. This path's a lot more sensitive to walk, but I believe with the right guidance, it is possible to balance all the heavy weapon archetypes using effort reward curves that make them all feel rewarding to use. Right now, weapons like heavy linears, for example, are incredibly underpowered, even while taking into account their ease of use. Finally, metas can also develop through player innovation and strategy, but as we've already established, this takes time and usually comes from the top, from players limit testing in challenge content, whether that's speedrunning or solo challenges or anything in between. And as we've seen from this past week, that kind of innovation isn't inspired by restrictive surges and unnecessarily difficult normal tier content. In fact, it's stifled. To echo other players, if you want to create challenge, great. Raise the ceiling, not the floor. And better yet, recognize players more for doing things in Destiny that are legitimately impressive. The fact that the canonical endgame goes as far as solo flawless dungeons and contests raised twice a year at most in year 7 is still something that is yet to be addressed. That's a topic for another time though. If you want players to experiment, let them. Don't try to force them to by boxing them in. In my opinion, I think fully reverting both changes is healthier for the game, and while I know Bungie is partially rolling back these changes by having essentially permanent universal 25% surges, I still think it would be better to allow us to overlevel by the same amount we used to be able to. I say this as someone who has just come out of a week of being in Templar, retesting every damage source value in the game. I have the most to lose from a rollback, and yet I still think this is the right way to proceed. I hope you guys enjoyed this style of macro breakdown, and while it's a little more topically limited than what I'll approach in the future, it's a starting point for more important and detailed discussions that have bigger implications. From the DPS meta at large to ability balancing, we're going to be talking about a lot in this series in its next installments. For now though, I have a lot of catch up to do on making other videos, so it's likely I won't return to this series for a bit. See you around!